Throughout the history of music, especially recorded music, there's been a lot of people that have been extremely influential on future artists and whatnot, some of which actually took it to a whole nother dimension, like to outer space. Welcome back into the Electric Lounge.
Hi there.
I want to welcome everybody to the lounge.
Let me put it to you this way.
You know where you are.
The Electric Lounge.
Welcome to the Electric Lounge.
Hit it.
Mr. David Jones, aka Davy Jones, aka Mr. David Bowie. We start with this one, which is his second Space Oddity, or the second David Bowie self-titled album, as he did do one before this, but that was his 60s pop, psychedelic type stuff, which was nothing quite like this. This was a whole nother level for him, and this was just the beginning of things that were to come that were going to take him into the David Bowie that we knew and grew to love, obviously. The song Space Oddity, still to this day a staple on radio stations throughout the entire world, I am sure. And, well-deservingly, such a great tune, such a great album, and such a super amazing beginning for a guy that kind of took the world by storm, and then continued to change and evolve over the years, and did things that none of us will ever be able to replicate, try though we might. Fucking genius. A couple of my favorites on this particular album would be Space Oddity itself, Janine, and God Knows I'm Good. Not to mention one of my favorite titles ever as far as a song, Unwashed and Somewhat Slightly Dazed. The same year he did his second self-titled album, aka Space Oddity, he released this one, The Man Who Sold the World. Some of you younger folk might think that might be a Nirvana song, but it ain't. This is another great album, and this is the beginning of his first era of being somebody that he wasn't thus far. He's not there quite yet, but he's pre-Ziggy at this point because he had just met Mick Ronson, and that would change his whole career, at least for the next 5 albums. Long-haired David was still stepping into himself at this point, and he wasn't really quite sure where he was going. He was still kind of adapting his style. But as we'll see throughout these years, his style never really stayed the same because he kept evolving. More so than many artists that I could ever think of, this guy has reinvented himself a plethora of times, up until the end. Which, even that was spectacular, done in truly Bowie fashion. Aside from the title track on this album, which is a great track and, as I said, made very popular by Nirvana many years later, we've got The Width of a Circle, which is one of my personal favorites, and then All the Madmen and The Supermen. 2 different songs, 2 different sides, 2 great tracks. Let's move on. So after Space Oddity and The Man Who Sold the World, he continued on with Mick Ronson as his guitarist and added 2 other people that would become his band for the next couple albums. That would be Trevor Bolder on bass guitar and Mick Woodmansey on drums. So we find ourselves here, the Hunky Dory album from 1971. So now he's got an actual band together, and this is the beginning of something that is absolutely incredible for the next couple albums. This album has a couple tracks that went on to be absolute mega hits, Life on Mars being one of them, and Changes, one of his biggest singles to this date that people know and love. For me, aside from the fact that I absolutely adore Life on Mars, Bewley Brothers, Quicksand, and Andy Warhol are other highlights on this particular album. But this whole album is spectacular. I've had arguments with people if this was better or the next one, and for me, this is what I would consider a perfect album. From the first drum hits of 5 years to the very last fade out of Rock and Roll Suicide is just absolutely perfect. It is a concept album about Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, his wonderful band, and the fact that David had taken himself from being just David Bowie to taking on this persona of being Ziggy Stardust. Maybe it did a little bit of damage to his head, but it definitely did a lot of good things for the rest of the world, especially the music world. It's also one of those tours that he did at this point that were heavily bootlegged, one of which I have on vinyl. This is from the Rainbow in London in 1972. This tour, and the band was firing on all cylinders. Bowie was on a different stratosphere, and he was just out of this world. Incredible in everything he was doing. Musicianship, songs, stage show, persona, everything firing. Where do we go from here? I'll add insane. I wouldn't consider it a perfect album as I do with Ziggy Stardust, but it is an incredible album. Panic in Detroit, Cracked Actor, his version of Let's Spend the Night Together, and of course, the mega hit Gene Genie. Man, this is a band that was absolutely on fire. Unfortunately though, they only did one more together, and this is an entire covers album. After this, the band broke up. Obviously David Bowie went on, but the actual band that was Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars would no longer be together, and that's unfortunate. For me, this is my favorite era of David Bowie, but that's not to take away from the many, many great things to come. What do we got on this one? Let's see. Pink Floyd, The Who, The Kinks. This is a tribute to all of the great things going on at that time, done Bowie style. And after this band breaks up, does Bowie slow down? I'm gonna go with a no on that. Not long after Pinups, we move to Diamond Dogs. And now that Mick Romson's gone, David Bowie's forced to pick up guitar on this, and there's a whole new slew of musicians. From the title track Diamond Dogs to the song 1984 to the ultra mega hit Rebel Rebel, another spectacular album by Mr. David Bowie. But that would be the end of his glam years. So, it's not to say that he never even touched upon the glam again, because he did. Before he went into his next full-on reinvention, he did something like this, which was Young Americans, his first album that he kind of took a step back and was far more reserved comparatively to his songwriting style prior to this. A little bit more R&B, a little bit more soul, and a really great album in and of itself. This one coming from 1975 with such tracks as, of course, the title track Young Americans, then you also have Fascination, his version of Across the Universe, a Beatles tune, and then Mr. John Lennon himself joins him for the ultra mega hit Fame. Keeping on his rolling ball of success, he does Station to Station. This is a little bit of a departure from where he was even on his last album, not going back to the glam and not staying in the R&B pop type thing that he had kind of found at this point. He does this, which is a little more avant-garde, a little more experimental, I suppose, but this is the beginning of his second stage as a performer, at least as far as his personas, and the introduction of the Thin White Duke. TVC 15 and Station to Station are two killer songs on here, but the one you probably know the best would be this one. Oh yeah. Golden. David Bowie's no stranger to doing drugs and having drug problems and whatnot, and he had a lot of issues with that during his Ziggy Stardust years, but by this point, now he's got more money, he's got more credibility, and he's got a lot more access to a lot more powder, and it did a lot of damage to him. So after he did Station to Station, it was time for him to say, alright, look, this is enough, I need a break, time to take a vacation and maybe go somewhere where I'm not as exposed to these type of things. So he takes his good friend Iggy Pop, bounces to Berlin, and then we get the Berlin Trilogy, starting with this one, the Heroes album. Great album. It's a very dark period for David Bowie because of the fact that he's living in Berlin, he's doing things differently, trying to get away from cocaine, from heroin, from all the drugs and influence, kind of going through this resurgence of trying to reinvent himself for yet another time. Second album in the Berlin Trilogy, the Low album. This album kind of feels even darker than the Heroes album. Some really good stuff, some great instrumentals, and some great interesting and introspective tracks, but very dark and very unfinished. It just feels like it's a bunch of outtakes, and it doesn't feel like it ever kind of got to fruition. And before he went on to the third one, he released this one, his actual second live album, Stage. This album focuses a lot of stuff from the Heroes album, but there's also a lot of earlier stuff. But this is another really great album and just shows the pure brilliance of David Bowie and how easy he is to just keep evolving and moving with the times throughout his career. Then the third and final in his Berlin Trilogy, the Lodger album. This one I didn't get that long ago, probably about 2 years ago, and I'd never really heard it before that, especially because it has a song called Look Back in Anger, which is just an amazing track. Which oddly, as I was going through these albums, I found it reappear 3 more times in my David Bowie collection. This goes to show you how you can know an actual artist for so many years and miss one track that all of a sudden, all these years later, that you all of a sudden grab onto and are like, wow, this is probably one of the best tracks I know by this artist. Surprise! This album is a little bit of a compilation of live stuff. It's a bootleg, obviously. It's called the David Bowie, the 1980 Floor Show, but it's got some really interesting stuff on here. One of the most interesting tracks being this version of I've Got You Babe with Marian Faithfull. Very strange. Probably one of the weirdest things that I've heard to date with David Bowie. And then he reinvents himself totally again and goes in a completely pop direction, more of an 80s type feel. This one coming coming out in '83, the Let's Dance album. Not only did this have the hit Let's Dance, it also had Modern Love and his remake of a song that he had written and given to Iggy Pop at that point, China Girl, which I actually feel that his version is a little better than Iggy's, but they both have their own merit. He did another thing that was really cool on that album, and that was adding a lead guitarist to do a lot of the solos on that particular album that was very unknown at that point. Little guy coming out of Texas, guy that went on to become a pretty big deal. Unfortunately, he ended up dying in the very early 90s, but that little guy named Stevie Ray Vaughan. This is another one of those bootleg type albums, although this is a full rehearsal of the 1983 shows when Stevie Ray Vaughan was actually on tour with David Bowie. Actually, that tour with SRV never ended up happening in 1983 because David was too controlling. Not only did he want SRV to do some crazy little choreographed dance while he was coming down the ramp, he also insisted that SRV was not allowed to talk about anything to do with Double Trouble or the fact that his Texas Flood album was coming out, so he quit before he actually did that tour, and this is the only thing that they have to prove that they actually worked together other than the Let's Dance album. It's a fly on the wall type thing. It sounds like an absolute soundboard recording and very cool. If you can look this one up and find your own copy, I would highly recommend it. Then many years later, after it actually happened, this got released. This is a bunch of footage taken from the original Spider's Days. This album is great, as is the movie. If you've never seen this, you should definitely check it out. It's a snapshot into the timepiece of where he was at that point in his career, and the track list on this is absolutely fantastic. I mean, this just sums up some of the best stuff of his career, in my personal opinion. It's weird to throw that Ziggy Stardust album in there out of nowhere, the soundtrack from Ziggy Stardust, because it's totally out of place with where he's at in his 80s career at that point. And that brings us to Tonight, which I have to say has one of my favorite David Bowie songs on it. Cheesy as it may be, I love the song Blue Jean. Remember? And this is just another thing that he's just evolving and getting very comfortable in his whole 80s thing, but a little too comfortable to where he ends up doing something like this. Ouch. Do you remember this video? I remember it quite well. Thought it was great at the time. Doesn't hold up quite so well in retrospect. Yes, it's David Bowie and Mick Jagger dancing in the streets. This is a great tune. Martha and the Vandellas originally. Grateful Dead did a great version of it. And this version isn't terrible, but it's certainly not the best. Talk about cheese factor, the way they're dancing and spinning around. Wow. You couldn't get much more 80s than that. Next up, we've got Labyrinth. Now, I love this movie. This movie was, it's one of those movies that to me it is my youth. This, Dark Crystal, Star Wars, etc., etc., etc. And honestly, listening to it afterwards, it's really not that bad of an album. Terribly dated, kind of cheesy, and we really should discuss the piece of sausage down David Bowie's pants. But Labyrinth was a good movie and a pretty good soundtrack overall. Jump, magic jump. Oh, and since we're talking about Bowie's cinematic moments, let's take a second to recognize his first feature-length film, The Man Who Fell to Earth. This was a strange film. Not to mention him in Twin Peaks as Agent Philip Jeffries. Bowie did some strange shit. But between Philip Jeffries and The Man That Fell to Earth, the Goblin King was just one more of the many characters that David Bowie played throughout his life. A true master of disguise. And still we move forward into the Never Let Me Down. Now we're moving into the later 80s, going in towards the 90s. David Bowie not slowing down whatsoever. Now, don't get me wrong, at this point he had slowed down in the fact that he is not getting the same amount of hits that he once had, but in the sense that he kept doing things that were relevant and he kept making new choices and doing things differently, never being stagnant in where he was as a musician, as an evolution of his actual career. David Bowie definitely had a very interesting career, and he touches on some of that on this one, the VH1 Storytellers album. A nice cross-section of his entire career, as well as some interesting stories from him. Though he gets distracted, never really gives many actual stories. He kind of just gives parts of them and then kind of gets distracted into another one. But still, a great album and some interesting versions of some classic tracks. So we're getting down to the wire of my actual collection of David Bowie. There's a few that I'm missing, but something that I missed more than anything was the fact that I missed this particular tour. That was 9 Inch Nails with David Bowie in 1994. How did I possibly miss this tour? I'm not sure. But at least there's bootlegs like this where I can actually go back and revisit and live some of these moments that I did not have a chance to be a part of in the actual moment. Speaking of missing him, it wasn't like I just missed him that one time. How did I miss this one? That's because I was living in Hawaii, and he didn't come to Hawaii, as most artists didn't, and I didn't have the money to go fly to see him in LA or anywhere else. This is a really great compilation. Everything on blue vinyl, 3 albums, really great set list, doing stuff throughout his entire career, and this is a prime example of how I said David Bowie could reinvent himself over and over and over. And I know I keep saying this, but it's true. He would take these songs that he's done a million times, and instead of playing them just like the greatest hits and throwing them out there like everybody else would do, he plays them in a totally different style, different tempos, different grooves, different vocal melodies. The whole thing is David Bowie in its essence. This album is spectacular. I am so glad I have this because I didn't get to see this live. And that brings me to the end of my David Bowie record collection, Black Star. So happy I got a copy of this before everything hit the fan, because we all know that once a musician dies, all of the records and things that they've ever done skyrockets because people are vultures. But in the end, he left us the way that he came in, with a bang. And for me, it was a very, very difficult time. The day that David Bowie died, I was woken up by my ex-wife to tell me that David Bowie died. Less than 3 hours later, my cat died in my arms. Not my favorite day. This is arguably one of the darkest and most beautiful albums of David Bowie's entire career. And it was released right as he was transitioning into the other world. Only David Bowie could literally speak to us from beyond the grave and plan it that way. Man, seriously, that Labyrinth video could not have been creepier. The first words in the video are, "Look up here, I'm in heaven." Are you fucking kidding me? Look, I don't want to get all philosophical and deep on this. I mean, this is a show about music, and that's what I'm going to keep it at. So that was my show on David Bowie. Do me a favor, like, subscribe, share. This is the Electric Lounge. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, I'm out. Peace.